about your work in this show. And just, I thought we would start off by talking about your process. We're looking at our photographs, but they're also photographs of a really rich and multifaceted studio practice that involves painting and sculpture and drawing and these temporal installations. And so I wonder if you could just talk us through a day in the studio of
I feel like it's a good question because I think a lot of times I'll be at a show and someone will be like, and then you painted this, and I'm like, oh, these are photographs, they're not paintings, they're not drawings, and they're not watercolors. But often I think because there's so much paint and paper in the work, it has this sort of trompe-l'oeil effect where people are like, but then you painted that. And I'm like, no. And then often there's this sort of weird thing where I'm like, yes, I painted it, but it's a photo of the painting. So I started as a photographer and began as a photographer, but began sort of quickly going from sort of still lives to then making things. And I think, always wanted to make artwork. And I worked for a sculptor, Tony Fair, after my undergraduate. And don't have any formal training as a sculptor, so the things that I made would always sort of fall apart and fall down, and I kind of would move them across the studio, and then they would be not the way that I set them up, and I would use fabric and paper, and I just the materials I was using were not really great sculptural materials, and I think I arrived at photography as this way of sort of freezing these sort of transient things that existed in my studio. And it also allowed me, I was never very good at making something very large, but through photography I could photograph a sort of smaller sculpture or a thing and make it big through photography. And photography also sort of played with point of view and scale and lighting, so the way that something was lit could make this thing that was sort of just a piece of crumpled paper feel really dramatic and kind of make it sort of hardened and give it this dramatic effect that made it look like it was made out of a different material, that it wouldn't feel as
Yeah. So when you're in the studio, are you making these really precise compositions, or is it more ad hoc? How do they develop in the studio?
Yeah, I feel it's two separate processes in some way, and it's not I'm now I'm gonna do this, but often I have an idea and I'm like, I wanted to make, I'm just looking at some of these, I wanted to make a bird, and so I used the dove emoji, because I wanted it to be very bird.
Yeah.
But I also liked that it was a symbol of it felt very rich, but I didn't have quite the right size tracing paper, but I wanted to make it big, so I sort of taped it together. So I sort of follow things and use the materials that I have, but I like that it's a little rough.
Mm-hmm.
And then often it's I'll pin it up, but the one that's over there where it's sort of in the net, I taped it or pinned it to the wall, and then I came in the next day and it had fallen and was sort of the way it fell, the way it crumpled, it was this sort of beautiful accident, and then the light sort of at this time made it had this sort of beautiful all over light that really made it sort of glow. Mm-hmm. And so this sort of glowing bird is then I sort of pull out the camera. And I think, and then there are these ones that have really dramatic natural light, like this one or that one. This one here, I had the studio, and for 6 minutes between 5:05 and 5:11 p.m. I'd get this beautiful light, and so every day it was this scramble where I would just be and I guess I knew, but I would somehow not be ready for it, and so it's I do a lot of really. I'm careful when I'm making my work, but then I think when the light hits, I'm often more of a documentary photographer, and often getting things that I'm not, they're not pre-planned.
Yeah.
And that goes back to your question. It's the pictures that I am using, I take a lot of pictures that I'm not showing, that are very controlled, but I think the pictures that I end up being most interested in and showing are the ones where there's an element, it's often having to do with the lighting or something falling down, where there's like an element of something that I didn't control, the unknown or the sort of accident that gets into the work, and I like that sort of activates it for me and for the viewer, or I hope the viewer.
Yeah. No, I think that it's true. Like they feel like these really active tableaus, and I think that that's like what's so interesting is that there's this tension between like what's recognizable as like an object or a material, and like paper in particular becomes like so recognizable, and then there's this like doubling of that, like a doubling down of the materiality of them that I think gets back to this like almost trompe l'oeil effect that like it starts to look like a watercolor again because of certain decisions you're making in like printing the photographs. And so then it's like they're printed on this really matte paper and they're not glazed and some of them aren't even framed, and so it's like it's paper being photographed and then rendered as paper. And so I'm curious if you could talk about this, like the layering of that as like a medium, like a sort of conceptual layering of paper, that's like a materiality, but it's the image of paper, and then it also like has this, there's like the depth of the space of the photographs too that like gets confused in that moment.
Yeah, I think that's interesting to me because I know that there's also a part of it that when I look at them, I know the space in which I made them and the way they're constructed. But then sometimes other people are like, but wait, is that on top of this? And I'm like, I can't quite see how other people see them, which is interesting. But I think I got to this point in an interesting way because I was trying to make sculptures, and it was a very earnest effort to try to make sculpture. But then at a certain point, like in the last few years, I was like, I'm not showing sculpture, I'm showing photographs. And so I think that I sort of started limiting some of my sculptural materials to paper. And I think I was interested in paper because it did have this sort of like meta, one-to-one, like these are images on paper, and that I wanted to use, like it's ink on paper. Basically, that's what a photograph, an inkjet picture is. So I wanted to use the medium of paper to make the things that I was photographing. And so I think that's like why we pinned this one over here, is that you look at, I wanted there to be at least one picture in the show where you're like, oh, this is like a picture on paper. And I mean, we picked that one because it was big and because that castle is sort of like falling down and there's all this sort of like billowing paper in it, and that I thought like pinning the piece to the wall sort of added to that, like sort of like windswept, blowy sort of vibe. And I think that sort of was also, a lot of these don't have floor in them. There's a lot of wall. And I think that was the sort of similar idea that like I wanted to make pictures that had a lot of depth and that trompe l'oeil thing, and like see how I could experiment with depth, but use just like a almost two-dimensional or barely three-dimensional space. Whereas before, I think, just as the work has developed, before I would sort of use the whole room and play with how the room could get flattened, I was sort of like, it's almost like a challenge. It's like, well, how can I do this and just really, it's like a cutout of the wall, which is sort of what the photos are too.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because then that becomes this way of like thinking about like, it's a structure, like that they're the wall and that they become these like almost like incisions or like portals to a different wall or something like that. And since you mentioned billowy and windswept, I like those words and like materials too, like that, the paper has this like flexibility to it and, maybe even like a fragility to it. And then so much of the imagery is very like, the process of photographing them like fixes them, and and then you're literally also like pinning things down. And so I'm curious if you could talk about that tension between like flowiness, fluttering things, and really fixed things, and how that too seems to like have a correlation with like the logic of photography, which is like fixing motion and fixing chemicals and.
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I think that there's a way in which like the pictures have that windswept, like flowy quality, but like nothing is moving in the pictures. And I'm interested in how, without like getting a fan in my studio, like how I can get that feeling. And I think there's something in maybe the way that is achieved is through process and through spending a lot of time, and that like the act of sort of like pinning things up and like sort of like the way I move around the studio, and like I'll take a string and pin it up and then it'll fall, and then I try to like move something over there, and there's all this sort of like motion that I've done in making of like working on something in the studio, like hanging this thing up and like throwing these pom-poms out, that is sort of, these are records of that, you know, really not in a like that you see me doing it, but that it's the sort of aftermath or midway point, because I'm not like, oh, it's done, so I take a photo. It's sort of like I'm sort of photographing, and I never really know which photos are going to work until usually like months later.
Yeah. Well, and what's interesting is that like, you know, pinning is like this, like it's a way of fixing something down, but it also sort of has this like temporary quality to it, because you can like move it around and like you can pin it somewhere else, or it feels like it's, it has like a temporary quality to it.
Yeah, and I think that's another reason we like pinned. The big one was to have that there are a lot of push pins in the photographs, and then to sort of have this quality that the way things are hung in the studio, we would hang a photograph in a space like that. Yeah, and I think, I mean, the ethereal nature of things is really interesting to me, and like I sort of like there's sort of like a melancholy to flowers and birds and these sort of like delicate creatures and flora and fauna, and that like, you know, like that art for me is like an attempt to sort of like still the moment, in a sort of like take a picture, but it's sort of like an attempt. Like each picture is like a moment in the life cycle in my studio of these things, and yeah, that's sort of how it goes.
Yeah. And it's like, I mean, I'm also, I guess now to like sort of start pivoting into some of the like imagery, like I have said to you and to others who are here, like the thing that like stood out to me first was like the repetition of grids throughout the work, which, you know, are multiple and I think have this like this slipperiness to them that characterizes like so much of what we talked about, that they are grids, like they're sort of recognizable as like, you know, intersections of horizontal and vertical lines, but in some that's, you know, a window pane that, you know, has been recreated through like the sort of like hanging sculpture that, you know, is like appears to be standing, but that seems sort of impossible. And then that's doubled by like a real window that is suggested but unseen by its shadow. And in others, it's this like netting where, you know, a grid is more like flexible and hanging, and then the kind of elasticity of that like becomes this like, you know, kind of wavy checkerboard. And so I'm curious about the grid, and also like the way that one thing sort of starts to like bleed into another thing or suggest something different.
Yeah, it's a lot of it is not conscious. It's not like I'm interested in grids now and I'm gonna make a gridded thing, but it must be somewhere in there. And I think the studios that had these gridded windows, I think I was interested in making a pattern or like something that had structure to it, but then within that having these like blowy things that are like not structured at all, and that these things that are sort of formless like exist within this thing. So it's like I sort of create a structure and then have things that, and then the structure itself sometimes sort of like falls apart.
And in these, the structure seems to be like always kind of intangible. Like, you know, we're not seeing a a window pane. We're seeing the shadow of a window pane.
The reflection.
You know, so it's like the suggestion of structure, or like its reflection, its shadow, its like presence, even though it's not really pictured and it's not materialized.
Yeah. Well, it's sort of like, I think it goes back a little bit to the photography thing. It's like, how do you hold something? And like a net is obviously like a physical way to hold on to something, but a grid also like will sort of like, if you're taking a beginning drawing class, sometimes you grid something out, and it's sort of like how you hold the space. But then I like never wanted, like I always want the sort of like narrative elements of like flowers and birds and these things that have like a sort of symbolic weight to come in and then be like caught up in that tension of being sort of like held or pinned down. And yeah, I guess it's all like that. I think of sort of the pinning is like the push pins, but the net, but also then the photograph is a way of sort of like, there are all these sort of attempts at trying to pin something down, and they're all like, I mean, hopefully the photographs aren't futile, but everything else is maybe a little isn't really like effective.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's all these different like structures or like organizing ideas, and you know, I think one, like in so many ways they provide this like structure for the narrative of the works to come through, and then that becomes like, you know, what is being held by all of these pins and nets and grids. And so I'm also curious with, you know, you talked a little bit about it with the bird, like this idea of a bird that then is also a symbol because it's a dove, but it's an emoji. So it's like, it's universal, but it's very specific. And I'm curious how the processes of like approaching or coming up with the symbols or the images that you're working with. You know, the show is called Fairy Tale. So like, do you go into it with fairy tale on the brain, or?
Very much not, but I think Fairy Tale is like, I like that title. So I'm sort of like, okay. I think like the dove emoji, I thought it was interesting to take something that we use digitally and make it physical, and make it like big and unwieldy, and sort of like reanimate it in a way that it gave it like physical body, and then sort of like take it away by photographing it. And sort of the order in which these were made is that I was making the dove and the flower and the tree that's back there, and sort of these sort of like physical, these things that were sort of like soft. And then I think I turned it instead onto more architectural things, like the castle is the most recently made piece, and I think I was like, well, what if you do the opposite? Instead of like a soft flower that is billowy, like what if you take something that is made out of like stone and you make it out of paper so that it like totally, it has the same sort of like ethereal quality as a flower. Something like that. And I think seeing the castle, I was like, I think that the castle piece sort of like made the Fairy Tale title come into being, because I was sort of like, oh, this piece has a lot of sort of like both like actual fairy tales that take place in castles, but then also like sort of like the way that I think some of the pictures almost feel like, because they're made out of paper, they sort of have this sort of like children's book, children's illustration thing, and some of the color palette does that, and
yeah, I mean, one of the things that's interesting is like you know, there's just like all these tensions, like there's different like moods to some of the different photographs, which are like, you know, at turns very like bright and open. You know, the piece behind us, you know, is the brightest work, you know, and it has this like open-ended window that is like permeable and like dividing a space but not really, and then and it's also like this grid that doesn't actually, it's not like obstructing anything. There's no like dove being trapped. And then you have the castle, which is like quite melancholy, you know, and like moody, and you know, through the lighting has this really almost more like ominous presence. And so then the paper has, I think, you know, this suddenly like these two architectural structures that are being hung, you know, with paper now have really different, they evoke something quite different. that one seems like on the precipice of falling and the other has this like surprising stability. And so I'm curious like how, I mean, you talked a little bit about it with like kind of capturing certain daylight moments, but how lighting in the studio is like generative in taking the photographs or in the work generally.
Yeah, I mean, I think lighting, I always use natural light, and so often when I move into a studio, I'm using natural light, and it's often the sort of way that I think it's like learning the space of the studio and the light, but I love that the light is like not up to me, and that I sort of like, I can respond to the way that the light sort of, that I know that it is, but that it's sort of like this factor that is not under my control. Yeah, I mean, I like that the work it's really important to me that the work have mood and like an emotional quality to it, and whether it's melancholy or sort of like, I think the one in the back is sort of has this like colorful joy, and that's, I think, just different phases of my life and like being in different places of like, oh, that, you know, like I hope that they're sort of like a reflection of myself.
Yeah. And then, like with Fairy Tale, how do you go about, like if you're describing the ways that you take so many photographs that then sort of get sifted through and brought together, so what's that process like of bringing together a group of works into a shared theme or idea, like the Fairy Tale or show?
Well, it's usually like if I'm very lucky enough to be presented with an opportunity in a show, I mean, I think we looked at all these works and it was like, there were these things like, oh, like a lot of this work is done with is like a lot of paper pieces, or that's sort of the material, that there are all these grids, like these three, this one, that one, and that one, but this wall, these ones in the white frames, it felt like they all were sort of playing with different ideas of the grid and paper, and it was like, oh, these will be good together, and then sort of like contrasting would be like these darker ones in black frames, and it was sort of like, okay, well, if we put this one in, then we set it, like it's sort of like playing with what goes well together.
But it's not, but you don't set out to sort of like make a series of work.
It's like, I don't know what's coming. I have no idea what's coming. And often it's like, I try to put off looking through the photos I've taken as long as possible, because I go in with like really what I think are like great ideas, but they're not very good ideas of like what the work is going to be. And the piece that I'm like, have worked really hard, or the photo that I've worked really hard to make is very rarely the photo that I will show. It's like sort of like these outtakes that end up being more interesting or something. It's like the ones that I like try to, like I overwork them, and they're like sort of like overly composed and like sort of, and so it's like, but I'm very attached to them in the weeks that I've made them, because I've spent so much time on them. But like sort of 6 months after making the photos, I can go through and be like, you know, that day was a wash, it's fine. But then I like found a good image, and so I sort of like go through, and then I can just process-wise, I then print out like sort of 8x10s of everything I'm interested in, and I just have those sort of like in the cyclone of my studio in my mind, just sort of just looking through them and being like sort of like, oh yeah, like what about that one from this time, and sort of like, I like seeing, there's like a lot of different studios in here. I've sort of been in a lot of different studios in the past few years, so I liked that it was like different spaces, different lighting conditions, but then there are these through lines of material and things that like hopefully unite the work.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because, and now to like bring up the show that we're not sitting in, but the show in North Carolina is like a 10, 12-year survey. And so I'm curious what that process was like to like look back on a decade's worth of work and bring those images together. And then, you know, this show opened the following week, which I'm so impressed by. And so like how you hold those two processes at the same time.
Yeah. I mean, it was interesting. I think I'm glad that I had made all the work and printed it before the North Carolina show, because I think I would have been in a strange headspace also maybe, headspace after the North Carolina show. But the North Carolina show is just very sort of like moving. It's like I mean, as an artist, it's like, here is your life a little bit. And it's like, wow, I made that 15 years ago, and it's hanging next to something I made last year. And it's like, there's like both a joy and a frustration of like, oh wow, I am doing the same things over and over again. But it was very gratifying to see all that stuff together. But I also saw a lot of stuff in that show of like, oh, like those are paths I didn't go down. Because I think as an artist, you can't make everything. Every idea you have, you cannot follow. And like even when you make one piece, you're sort of like, okay, I'm going in this direction.
Yeah.
And as a photographer who makes a lot of pictures, like the way you edit the pictures, like I could be a sort of very different photographer if we put different kinds of photos in. So I think that that's interesting. But it was nice to see this show because it felt like some of the things that we talked about earlier, like the sort of like the flatness of the wall and the sort of like how a lot of the pictures of where there's a lot of floor have dropped out, and that was sort of like, I was like, oh, that makes sense after these 12 years of work.
Yeah.
And like sort of where some of the imagery comes from and the sort of like ephemerality. I think that like working, I think some of the sort of flowers entered the work and some of the stuff from the natural world, because I would see my studio almost like a garden. And it was like, oh, these things sort of like grow, and I like sort of been taking pictures of their lifespan, and then something falls on them and they get crushed. And it's sort of the whole sort of like from beginning to end. And so I think that's how sort of like some of this imagery has come into being. It was like, oh, well, that's sort of like a garden, but if I put actual like images of plants into the work, so that it's actually sort of like vines growing or flowers growing, and that also has this sort of like that movement that I like, and sort of like evoke some of that.
Yeah. It's interesting because there's always this like kind of play with literalness. You know, like if it's like I'm thinking of it as a garden, so I'm going to put flowers in it, but then the flowers are not real flowers. No. You know, and so there's like this thing that is not what it claims to be. You know, like these are photographs that are of sculptures. These are sculptures that are not. These are actually photographs.
That reminds me of something that's like a little different, but I do think there's also like a bit of something I like about the work is that there's like a little bit of denial. Like sometimes people are like, well, what's the scale of the thing? And I'm like, I'm like, and there are clues. There are like little things from our world that you can, if you know what the size of that is, you can sort of deduce the scale. But that there is like, sometimes people are like, I want to see the actual thing, but you like don't really get to. You only get to see a mediated version of the thing. It's a little bit like
what is the actual?
Yeah, what is the actual thing? And it's like you're seeing like a drawing of a flower, not an actual flower. It's sort of it's a lot of remove.
Yeah. And I'm also curious, like, if having now done the survey and this show, if like having seen that scope of work, you're describing like, oh, those were the road, like the paths not taken, and these are the things that have persisted. Like, what if you think it has shifted any of the things that you think the paths you're going to go down?
I imagine it will. But I think that there are some stuff that I'm like, that's a good idea. Like, why don't I do that? Or like, But who knows? I don't know. I don't know now.
I'll check in another 10 years.
10 years, we'll see.
All right. Well, that's the end of my questions.
Do people have other, for the audience, if other people have questions?
Comments, thoughts?
Yeah.
Go ahead. Do you want to go?
It's funny you mentioned the gardener. I totally saw that, especially sitting in this room. And I'm curious how far you take that in just the idea of building objects. And the light is such an important part of the work, and sort of the daytime you're moving amongst the works. But, are you bringing flowers into the studio? You're bringing kind of nature in? Is that something that you utilize, or is it you really just want to create your own representations of it?
There's been moments where I found this really beautiful palm frond that fell in my neighborhood during a storm, and I brought that into my studio and sort of like tied it up for a while. Recently it's been more imagery, but I think the gardener thing, I think maybe another correlation is that there's like a certain amount of like care to the work, and that it is like I really do like care about these things that I'm making, and so like there's like an attention that I feel like the gardener has to their plants that I'm trying to give to the sculptures or the things that I'm making, of like, all right, like grow. Yeah, I think also like, just to reiterate this, and I don't know why I'm thinking about this in relation, but I never like set up the camera and I'm setting something up or in front of it. It's sort of like I'm like having an experience in the studio and like moving stuff around and trying to make it, and I'm like, oh, what would it be like if I like painted this purple grid, and then it's like, okay, I should put something on top of it, and then I like come in and the light is doing this crazy thing, and then I'm like, shit, I have 2 minutes, and so I pull out the camera, and it's sort of like this, like trying to get this, like coax the image out of the thing that I'm making, rather than like, I don't know, because sometimes people are like, the photos are constructed, and like the world is constructed, but I don't feel like I'm like constructing images really. Yeah. Like every picture here, every picture here was not like pre-thought out and like constructed. Right. It was more like I had an idea for something else. Like the castle thing was like a sort of like, I had put it on the side of my new studio, and it was sort of like draping on the ground, and then the light hit in this really dramatic way, and so like it's sort of like in the storage area of my studio rather than the sort of main thing. But I like that sort of like that thing. Yeah. I think also like, Mackenzie.
Oh no.
No. You go, and then I'll go.
That's fine. I was just going to ask you about scale and how you make choices.
Oh yeah.
About the size of these images.
I mean, I print everything out sort of 8 by 10 just to look at it, and then there are some that I have a sense. Like the castle one, I was like, this has to be big. It sort of has to feel like a building. You have to be able to like enter it, and then I'll sometimes print things sort of like slightly bigger, like 16 by 20, and then I'll be like, oh no, this has to be smaller. And like, it's always really important to me to have, in an exhibition, have pieces be different sizes, because I think if someone makes the effort to come to a show, there's like this bodily thing with the work where you like, with a big one you have to get further back, and then a small one you have to get closer to see, and that like they really change sort of the scale of them, but a lot of it is sort of trial and error and then there are some that like I didn't get the focus quite right, and so it's like, okay, that is going to be a small one because it won't blow up very big. So that's such like a practical thing. Yeah.
That's sort of interesting though, because it's like you're sort of choreographing a viewer's like relationship to the work in these different ways, and that has these kind of correlations to like the way you describe your studio practice is like having this almost performative element that you're like making and moving and photographing, and it's like this kind of constant like there's no like set workflow of like you do this then this then this. It's this kind of like moving in and out and in multiple directions. Yeah. And then you're sort of like staging the work in a way that kind of asks the viewer to do the same.
Yeah, I mean, I think about dance a lot. Like, I think about moving and like how I like get on a ladder and like pin stuff up, and I'm sort of like when I'm really working in the studio, I'm really moving around a lot, and so I see them as this sort of thing. And then I saw pictures of myself talking in North Carolina, and I was like, oh, I like gesture a lot while I'm talking, and I was just like even this, I'm sort of like, it's weird to be sitting and talking, because I feel like I'm sort of like more naturally inclined to talk with my hands. And so I think the work, I mean, I think that goes back to that question about like sort of like, the work is weirdly like a lot of stillness. It's like a lot of like contemplation and like looking at things, but then like I want there to be like the movement in, like I don't want the pictures to be like, I don't want them to be still. I want them to have a dynamic quality.
Without a fan.
Without a fan, yeah. Maybe the next thing up is a fan, yeah.
Yeah, that actually touches on like what I was really reading from them was this like activation of the imagination, and that I as a parent was like having this read of like things that I used to make for my children, to play within, and then this activation of the imagination, which feels very theatrical. But it like touches on how you're like moving through this space and kind of activating the.
Yeah, I think also like I don't have any background in sculpture or painting in a sort of like I didn't take sculpture or painting classes, so my way of making things is like not childish, but it's not like sometimes like friends who are real sculptors come over and they're like, why are you doing it this way? And I'm just like, well, it's like what I thought the way that you would do it. And so I think there's like a little bit of like the amateur painter and like sculptor and like maker, but that gives it this sort of like very a little childlike human quality to it, and like some craft and like.
I would use the word like naive and like vulnerable, like a vulnerability that's like really lovely.
Like vulnerability is a great word. I like that. Yeah. And then I want to combine some of that not knowing with like I have taken a lot of photography classes and know how to use a camera, so like that there's a combination of like not knowing and then like knowing how to do something, and I want both those things existing in the work. Like, like what would this look like with like I sort of know how to use a camera. sort of. Yeah. I mean, I don't know how to take a picture of a person, but
maybe their shadow.
Yeah, their shadow can do.
Are there any other?
Yeah, I like to think of like the playfulness and all this as kind of like a crazy scientist, like a Frankensteinian type of thing. And I'm wondering, you mentioned that there are some paths that you didn't go down. I'm wondering, is that a function of you lost the lease on the studio, or you did this as part of a residency, and so you're no longer in that space? And if there is a space that really just did fantastic stuff for you, and spaces that just did not work, and so.
That's a good question. I think I went to grad school, and then after grad school I had this studio, and then sort of was like forced to move a year later. And so early on in my sort of artistic life, I had to move studios a lot. And then I realized that I liked moving studios a lot, and then that was actually important for me, was to sort of like learn the light, set up in the space, and then have a few years in there and then move somewhere else. That like I wanted to sort of like, I like the process of like learning the space and learning the light, but then I want to like every time I move studios feels like a big jump, like a sort of new thing, and that's like exciting for me. So I don't know. So I don't have. I'm nostalgic about a lot of things, but not really studios. Like I sort of like, because like the new studio feels exciting. It feels like, oh, this is like a space I can learn, and like sort of like, ooh, this will like, what will this produce? And that's sort of like the unknown.
Yeah. Do you feel like you can sense shifts in the work when you move studios?
Yeah, I just moved to a studio, and I think there's something. I moved my house and my studio, and now my studio is in my house. And before I was working in a much more industrial space, and I think my ability to like throw paint around was better, and I don't think my landlord would appreciate that. And it's just a different scale and it's a different like sort of vibe as a space. And that's why I think the work will change into like maybe being a little more domestic, and I'm excited. I'm like interested in that. I'm like
I could ask a question that I'm thinking about. It's sort of a version of maybe a conversation that we've had before, but especially because you use the word outtake, like which I really like for thinking about how you select works. Like, can you talk about your relationship? And this might be like a general question for a photographer, but like your relationship to all the photos that you don't select. Like how do you how do you use them? Do you return to them? Can you like call them an artwork later? Like, are they done once there's a piece that's selected from that greater body? Like, I'm always so curious about having this great selection of pieces that haven't made it out into the world.
It's so nerve-wracking because you're like, did I make the right selection? It's such a good question because I feel like there will be like a setup that is just not working that I'll have like thousands of photos for, and then like for a lot of these, it's like I have like two. Two pictures, and then there are some pictures where I know that there is like one good image, but it's like a setup of this table, and I took like way too many photos of it, and I start going through, and I just get overwhelmed, and I'm like, whatever, I'll look at those later. And so I know that there's like a good picture in there somewhere, but I can't pull it out. Like, I just can't, I'm just like, ugh, it just overwhelms me every time. There's like too many options. I think the things I don't select, I think it's like, it might be like a painter who like makes I'm thinking of a painter who maybe like adds a lot to their painting while they're making it. Like, they know that like the first draft of the painting isn't the good one. So I think photos, you have these outtakes, and some of them it's like, yeah, I'm okay with the fact that this one is not great, and that like I can let it go. So I think there's a way of like releasing on it. But there are things, yeah. Any other questions?
I don't know if it's fully formed yet, but I was thinking about the ephemerality of photography, if that's like sort of its natural state, I guess. And so I'm wondering about like, I don't know if this is okay to reference, but I'm thinking of like Andy Goldsworthy and sort of like the sculptures that disappear, and like that's the point of them. And so I'm wondering like maybe your relationship between like ephemerality, like photography, and how you fit that in terms of like sculpture, because it also feels like you're sculpting with light, like just the way that works in terms of photography in general. And so I'm just like wondering like that dichotomy for you, and like,
yeah. I think that's interesting. I mean, I think I love like really ephemeral, ethereal artworks, but I like having like an object and an image that lasts, like it. But I mean, sometimes photography sometimes I'm like, oh, like, how can you add more? Like, photography is such a frame. I mean, and maybe that's also part of the grid, is like, oh, this is such like it's so like set, and it's so in focus, and like, how can I like get it to not be a rectangle? And so like I have frustrations with photography of like, oh, like, what if, like, can we get more? But I also think that photography for me has become this thing of like, I mean, the thing is like, it seems, I think, like in my photos, and maybe that's why I don't like the constructed photography thing, it's like that you could go back and take it again, but I can't really ever go back and take it again. Like, I move things around, like the things fall apart, they fall down, I like let them get sort of like trampled on. So like the studio is really ephemeral. Like what it looks like one day is really different than what it looks like the next. So, and sometimes I'm like, damn, I didn't get a good picture when like the setup was really right, and like, I like overpainted it. But that is sort of like part of the ephemeral, is sometimes like the regret or the picture that I forgot to take. And I'm like, wow, I did them all like this, and then I like, I don't know, like didn't do this thing that was like so obvious. Like, or what, they were all out of focus. Like, but that's just sort of like a beautiful life thing that's also like, that I think is sort of like your question, like moving forward. It's like, I hope that like some of the ideas that I had that I haven't quite worked with, I can like work with in the future, and that will hopefully come back. And I think it's like, I sort of like, and maybe your question as well, of like something that I like, I'm like, ooh, I liked that. Like, I sort of trust that like things that I'm interested will like come back, and I'll get interested in new things, and that will like continue to like hopefully animate the work further and like push it into new directions. Yeah. Like the last thing I'm like gonna say is that like I think kind of thinking about like childhood and structure is because I've been thinking about this a lot, like, with the grid as like this thing that is also like sort of like in art history, and we talked about this a little bit, is like sort of like it's considered very modern and like no narrative. And I like really like these grids that then like hold like a really funny, or not funny, but like a symbol that is evocative. And I think that there's a way in which I'm like quite regimented and like I'm really drawn to things that are ephemeral and ethereal, but like in certain ways like I'm not. Like, and I think the studio becomes a place where I can like have a structure and a routine, but then I like try to let my head go to the place of like childhood or like fantasy, but I don't think I'm an artist who like lives in that mindset all the time. It's like I view that as sort of like the like joy of being an artist is like going to the studio and sort of like letting my mind and my body and my hands like do things and being like, whoa, like I didn't know I came up with that. Like it's sort of like that's the place is like, and it's often like, oh, the light came in this weird way and it caught this thing and then I'm like, whoa, like look at that image that I always am wanting to make images that I like didn't expect. So like I'm like, whoa, like how did that happen? Because like I look at these and I'm like, and especially looking at the retrospective, I was like, especially the older like sort of like work, I was like, whoa, those are cool. Like how did I like who made those? Like they just did not feel like I like it when I like don't feel all in control.
Yeah.
Like I think that also it relates to like an ephemeral quality is like this sort of quality of life that it just you cannot hold on to it, and then like I want the work to be like a flutter, a whisper of like trying to hold on to like a certain kind of ephemerality.
Yeah. Well, that seems like a good